when we look at technology. One is it's got to in some way either improve the experience, meaning, we have three clients. Our clients are clients, tenants, and vendors, essentially, right? We do a lot of our maintenance in-house, but we have to keep three different groups happy at a minimum, and our employees. And so our technology has to either improve that experience or increase efficiency, right? Those are one of the two things that has to do. And if we can do one of those two things, then we're very open to taking a look.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode here on the Multifamily Wealth Podcast. In this episode, I'm chatting with Casey Howe, who is the CEO and founder of Howe Property Management, which is a property management company based in Massachusetts. This is also where Casey is based and where Casey lives. And in this episode, we dive into Casey's story and talk about how he transitioned from building large sales teams at startups and large Fortune 500 companies to getting into property management, which is an interesting leap and an interesting career change. But Casey has started and built a very large, successful property management company that's based in Massachusetts. They do scattered site management, manage over 1,000 units. And in this episode, we chat specifically about the property manager's role, or a property management company's role, in the asset management process, and how they specifically help with asset management in terms of working with their clients. Talk about how they're leveraging technology, talk all about really the role of a PM. We also talk about what makes a great property management client. And I think that's something that's really important to understand for the owners and the operators out there that are working with third-party PMs, because it'll help you build a better relationship with your property manager and your property management company. So great episode here. Be sure to listen to this entire thing. We get into a whole bunch of different topics. Casey's audio is coming through his computer. It's a little bit lower quality than what we typically do on the podcast, but it's still a great episode, and we cleaned it up a lot in editing. So again, be sure to stick it out. We discuss a whole slew of really important and impactful topics, especially for the active active PMs and active multifamily investors out there. And again, if you have enjoyed the podcast, or if you've ever learned something from the podcast, please consider leaving the show a rating and review, as it helps the show get noticed by more folks. But without further ado, let's get to this episode with Casey Howe. All right, I am here with Casey. Casey, how we doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me. Happy to be on. I've listened to you a lot. It's fun being on this side of the microphone.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate you taking the time. And I always like chatting with somebody else who's in the real estate business in New England. We talked about it a little bit before I started recording here, but for some reason, I don't think that there's many New England-based folks who are appearing on podcasts or hosting them or creating online content. It's like Texas, Southeast, Southwest, Florida. Why that is, I don't know, but it's always nice to buck that trend. So I'm glad to have you here. But let's start with your story. Rewind however far back you want to go. But maybe talk about how you get into real estate, what you've been up to since you've been in the business, and what your business looks like today.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thanks for having me. So, it's funny. I don't come from a real estate background. I mean, historically, I found my way out of college in a business sales role. I developed a love for business growth. And, I ended the last 10 years or so, I was in software and SaaS technology sales. So really building large sales teams for both Fortune 5 and startup companies. During that process, I think I developed a real love for, one, building teams, and two, technology. And I had a unique set of life circumstances that allowed me to take a little bit of time off about 7 years ago, when we moved back from San Francisco to COD, and I spent some time. I looked at some different concepts. I knew I wanted to start my own business, and landed on property management. And, it came from a couple reasons. One, I thought I could focus on building something from the ground up. I thought there was a need in our space. It's not to say there aren't good management companies. There certainly are, but there aren't very many. I think that really speak to the investor with a high degree of business acumen, and it's just hard to find them. I mean, I called around for property managers and no one answered the phone. I got a couple, maybe they called me back, but it wasn't a really it wasn't a really built out market in my view. And so I could combine building a team with technology, which I think was underutilized in the space. And I had a background with what I saw as a pretty big market need here in New England for multifamily property managers.
Gotcha. And when was this? You might have mentioned it, maybe I missed it, but how long ago?
Yeah, it was 2017. So we formed the business in November of 2017. So it's just about 7 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because I think oftentimes the folks who get into property management, it's like, one track is have some level of interest in real estate investing, maybe, owned a couple buildings. Okay, I'll start a management company, do this for other people. But the folks that come from other industries, at least what I've anecdotally noticed, is like it's a lot of like engineers and like operational folks who are a little bit more process oriented, systems oriented, and not to say that building sales teams, it's not important to build systems and build processes, et cetera. But it's an interesting background to get into property management. Probably gave you a little bit of a different view as well than maybe just the background of a lot of folks who get into that particular business. Just something interesting that I've noticed. I don't know if you've
Yeah,
noticed the same, but
no, I did. I think, it's sort of the greatest strength, greatest weakness thing is, I've leveraged it, I think, to as an asset to be able to come in with fresh eyes and the understanding of how to build teams and how to build things and also how to leverage technology. Because I think technology still, but certainly when we started the business is underutilized in the space. There's a lot of things I think we can do to provide a better client experience and a better tenant experience with technology. But my greatest weakness too, I didn't know anything about fair housing or how to physically manage a property. And so I've had to build a really strong team. One of my first hires was a director of operations that's come in and built out our maintenance and operations function. So, as well as anyone, you've got to surround yourself with people who fill in the gaps of where your experience is. And I think we've done a decent job at that. But coming in with fresh eyes was helpful too. I think that maybe noticed some things in some ways other management companies were doing things that were just a bit outdated.
yeah, yeah. And at least you don't have the perspective of, well, this is how it's always been done. So let's go ahead and do our version of it, right? Which I think is critical too for any
Yeah.
business, not let alone property management. So you mentioned multifamily management. Talk about what you guys manage a little bit to give the audience context. Small multifamily, large, mix of
Yeah.
both.
Yeah, so we do a lot of B and C class value add small multifamily. When I say small multifamily, I think 80% of our buildings are, the triple deckers that you see in places like Taunton or Dorchester or Brockton. Do a lot of, outside of Boston. So South Shore, we do anything South Shore, South Coast, Cape Cod. Not to say that we wouldn't go in Boston, but I think there's some good providers in Boston, and we realize there's a big need outside of Boston. For a lot of our investors live in Boston or work for companies in Boston and invest outside of the city because there's a little bit lower of a price point. But yeah, that's where we play.
Yeah. So scattered site, fun. That's I guess the buzzword industry wide, scattered site, small management, which I think a
Yeah.
lot of folks who are at least on the large side of the business, they see the challenges, I guess is the easy way to put it, of managing scattered site, right? You got 100 units, a bunch of triple deckers, maybe you got 20, 30, 40 buildings that you're managing that comprises that 100 units. That's what we do in New Hampshire primarily. And there are a lot of challenges with that. Similar to you, it sounds, we obviously heavily leverage technology to try to streamline as much of that process as we possibly can. So let's start there because you've mentioned it a few different times. And I think that this is a really opportune time to be having this conversation because I think right now, even the oldest, longest tenured PMs who have maybe been running their management company for 20, 30 years, like a lot of the long-term industry stalwarts, whether it's down in the extended Boston area or up here and up in New Hampshire or wherever in the country, are like, okay, I got to figure out this technology stuff. I got my property management software. Maybe I've got like a tool to help with leasing or something like that, and I'm using Slack to communicate. But now it's like, now we're starting to get into AI tools, we're starting to get into process management tools. And I think like you just have to figure out how to adopt this right now or you're going to truly be left behind. So I guess the question that I have for you is whether you want to share any tools or resources that you use that are, helpful for you guys or or how you at least think about implementing technology into the business and where you're seeing opportunities to create a system through some piece of technology or use technology to replace an individual, however you want to take this. Let's just talk about what you're doing behind the scenes and I'll let you kind of run with how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, 100%. So look, I don't want to make it sound like we've got like one person working here and everything's just some great AI model that manages everything for us. There's a lot of sweat and tears that go into what we do, but the way I look at it is as follows. I think it's very easy these days. Let me give you the sort of other side of this first. It's very easy for people to jump on the latest, shiniest object and from a technology perspective and focus on that. That's, I think, the wrong approach, having sold technology for years. I think the right approach is figuring out what is the best process, right, that we need to do to achieve a certain objective. So let's say it's leasing a vacant unit. And then combined with that is, do we have the right people in place, right? So you have to have really good people that are, first of all, open to using technology. They're critical thinkers. They meet the core values of the company. Once you have the good people and you have the process defined, then the question is there a piece of technology that can help us do this more efficiently or better? If you get that reversed, you just start, you're just evaluating technology sort of endlessly and grabbing at things, and it's not effective in my experience. And so that's the way we look at things. I think there's a couple of things we want when we look at technology. One is it's got to in some way either improve the experience, meaning, we have three clients. Our clients are clients, tenants, and vendors, essentially, right? We do a lot of our maintenance in-house, but we have to keep three different groups happy at a minimum, and our employees. And so our technology has to either improve that experience or increase efficiency, right? Those are one of the two things that has to do. And if we can do one of those two things, then we're very open to taking a look at it. And the low-hanging fruit for us, obviously, you need a good property management accounting system. We use AppFolio. We're transitioning to AppFolio now, actually, from PropertyWare. We use a good piece of leasing software called Tenant-Friendly. We're actually evaluating that now as well. So one of our core values is iterate and improve. And a lot of times, the technology that got you to today, we found the technology that has gotten us to today will not get us to where we need to go tomorrow. And so we're constantly evaluating these things, but every piece of our business, we're leveraging technology where we can.
Yeah. Are you guys doing anything on like the communication side, whether it's leasing? Well, so we use Tenant-Friendly as well. I think it's a great software. There's all types of different communication, right? You have a resident who is complaining about their neighbor, or they're submitting a maintenance request, or a prospective resident is reaching out with questions about a unit. Do you guys take dogs? Is there parking? Is that still something that's very kind of handled behind the scenes with a team member, with a human being, so to speak? Or are you guys doing anything on that front with technology to optimize that process? This is me selfishly asking.
No, it's a good question. So we orient our people around our support staff, our centralized support staff, right? People that are not out at properties physically doing things. We orient around either clients, so they're client focused, or they're resident focused, or they're sort of maintenance coordination focused. And there's different methods that we're communicating with each of those. So tenants, we prefer to leverage, we use TextLine. We prefer to leverage, it's a consolidated texting platform. The same number they can call 24/7, that number texts to this texting platform. We can assign those, it's almost a ticketing system. Those get assigned out to the individual that handles that certain situation. I can manage metrics in terms of how long it's taking to get back to people. We create automations, sending follow-up texts, looking for ratings and stuff like that. So that's really helpful. Clients, I think we're a little bit more nimble on how we want to approach it. We have some clients that want to talk on the phone. We have other clients that work via email. We haven't found emails work great for residents in the types of units that we manage. Text works great. So those are the things that we use. I'll tell you a little bit about our roadmap for lack of better terms. I am very interested. I'd say 80 or 90% of the questions, and you know this, that we answer are probably the same. Where do I pay rent? How do I submit a maintenance ticket? Can I have pets? I don't think they ask if you allow smoking anymore. Haven't heard that one in a while. But you get a lot of the same questions. And so what I'm really interested in doing is essentially taking all of my data from TextLine, all of our email data, and feeding that into a language model essentially that says, okay, here's how we answer this question and that question. And you know how it is when you go on a website and there's a chat and you ask a question, 50% of the time it answers it and it's good. And the other 50% of the time it tells you to read an article that doesn't apply, and you can go and then that sort of gets escalated to speaking with an actual person. If we can do that in a way where we do not sacrifice what the product that we deliver to a client, a tenant, or a vendor, that's technology I want to implement. If we piss everyone off in the process, it's probably not worth it.
Yeah, I think the last piece of what you mentioned is so critical. And that's what we found in our business, because I think we're arriving at the same destination that you are, which is there are a lot of questions that are asked on a regular basis, and you can systematize behind the scenes where it's just like copy paste standard response. You can try to streamline the communication there. But it would be nice to have some type of interactive model on your website homepage. And when you onboard a new resident, you say, hey, scan this QR code. It's going to take you to this site. You can ask it a question, whatever, if you have any. But the next thing you know, especially I think in the buildings that we manage, particularly in, B and C class, and really in C class, which is most of what we own and manage, those people just want to talk to someone, right? A little bit less tech savvy, I think just broadly speaking. And
Yeah.
yeah, if they're not getting their answer right away, you're just pissing people off. And now the person who has to be on the other end of the phone call has got an angry resident and they're having a bad day. So we've been trying to figure out how to strike that balance. I don't think the technology, at least in the tools that we've tried, has like gotten to the point to where we're comfortable with it yet, for the reason you mentioned, right? And I think a lot of folks outside the PM business that aren't in the trenches on a regular basis just assume that you should just be doing that. But it's like the last thing you want to do is poor tenant experience, poor resident
Yeah.
experience. They're frustrated. For some reason, it impacts their desire to renew a lease. And now that's a downstream thousands of dollars ramification, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, an interesting inflection point that the business is in, or the industry is in, I think, generally speaking.
I think that's true. And the fact that you hit on resident experience there, I mean, it's aside from sort of the larger multi-unit sort of A-class premier living spaces, the resident experience, by the way, we're trying to transition from calling them tenants to residents. I think there's just a nicer ring
You heard
to
me
it.
going back and forth too.
Well, I do. It's a tough transition to make, but I think it's important, right? We're also going from owners to clients and it's not sort of euphemisms. It's more, if we think of people as residents, which they are, we think about their experience more than if we think of them as tenants, right? There's just something about the word, at least in my view. And so, there are very good, I think, objective metrics out there now, particularly as it relates to things like ticket response time for maintenance that impact renewal rates. And I don't know if you've seen some of the stuff that like Property Meld has put out in terms of, they're managing sort of metadata across all these management companies nationwide. And they're saying, hey, look what we've seen in terms of they're matching that up to renewal rates in terms of reduced ticket time. And I'm not saying send a plumber on a Saturday if it's not something that needs to be done. We want to make sure we watch the wallet of our client. But, if you can fix an issue in 48 hours that otherwise would take 2 weeks, and it's the same cost to get it fixed in 48 hours, do it, right? And so we are very aware of the resident experience. And I think you're absolutely right. If we're not going to implement a piece of technology if it's going to completely piss off the residents. Now, I will also say there's some training stuff you can do in there too with residents that we found helpful, which is, when someone calls us, we try to answer the phone. If we don't get to a part of our message is, if we do not get your call, please leave a message. If you do not leave a message, we will not know to call you back. And that sort of prevents this thing where they just keep calling you. And then we also say something along the lines of, if you would prefer, please text us. All texts are responded to within an hour by an appropriate member of our staff and may enhance or reduce the amount of time or something like that. So we're trying to teach people, but then the thing is you have to make sure you actually get back to that person within an hour. And once you do that, I think you train them, they realize, if I text this number, someone's going to get back to me. They're usually pretty happy to do it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's funny, the renewal rates being an important metric to manage as it relates to the cost of turnover. I think it's, once you start understanding that that's the biggest number, like in terms, well, not specifically renewal rate, but just managing vacancy, managing revenue, just as a concept, right? That's the most critical part of managing any rental property, small multifamily, large multifamily, single family, whatever it is. That's the most critical thing to figure out. And then you start going, okay, what impacts that? And there is some technology that helps with that, but there is a lot that if you were to onboard it, you're doing so maybe because you want to trade manpower behind the scenes, but then you're giving up experience. And it's like, well, now we're at a point in time where you just have to start thinking about the downstream impacts of that. And I think that's, funny enough, I always get a kick out of like all of the, I know you come from San Francisco and the tech world, but I think there's so many folks who are out there that like start these prop tech companies and they start they start trying to figure out how to disrupt PM companies, and whether it's the, language models or software or other iterations. And it's like, look, does it serve that specific function? Because if it doesn't, then we're just making things harder where we don't need to. But it's a funny rant, I guess, as an aside. I do want to switch gears here though, because I want to make sure that we get to this topic here, which is a statement that you've made: investors need asset managers. And you clearly have a view around the role of a property management company or property manager as it relates to their role in asset management as well, and working with owners or clients as you describe them. Maybe talk about that thought at a high level, and then maybe talk about what you guys do within your business that allows you to be, maybe involved in the asset management side or provide some further service to your PM clients that maybe other PMs can't or aren't, I should say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I certainly think there are some PMs that I think it's probably the next buzzword is asset management. I think a lot of people are going to start using it and they're not actually doing it. But I do think we're not the first ones to think of it. But I do think there's a little bit of a disconnect between what, I hear this phrase a lot, manage the manager. And
Mm,
that phrase always sort of, as a leader of a property management company, it always sort of irks me a little bit. Not because I don't want expectations placed on myself or my company, but because I want to be good enough as a management company to be making those recommendations and strategic recommendations and operating at a level that a investor would be anyways, right? So I don't want to feel like I need to get on a call once we can be told, hey, you should probably lower rent by $25 in this unit, stuff like that, right? Not because I mind partnering and listening to an investor, but because I feel like that would mean we're probably not doing our job. And so I think, I do think that there are some things if you think through asset manager versus property manager. I think just some tactical examples. I think a property manager, you're probably getting your monthly statement PDF to you once a month. It probably doesn't make very much sense. It may not align with your P&L. I think asset manager is sitting down with you once a month or once a quarter, and they're actually aligning their P&L and cost codes to what you're using with your accountant, and they're really taking a lot of that bookkeeping off of you. I think an asset manager versus a property manager is, meeting with you as frequently as you need, but certainly on a quarterly basis to understand, like, what is your actual strategy here, right? So if you're a
yep.
syndicator, for example, what is your strategy? Are you trying to, turn this over in 5 years, or is this a buy and hold? How can we help you better align and better present to your investors as a syndicator data that's helpful for you to explain what's going on with your properties and not sort of disingenuously communicate it to them, but how can we help you and be in your corner that allows you to help your investors understand what's going on and potentially, seek out more investment, aligning just with that strategy and making sure that we're providing like reporting to you on an ongoing basis that allows you to see what's going on with your properties. I think, if you look at a lot of the surveys that have gone out to investors, there's a good one, I forget who put it, I think it was Profit Coach, maybe somebody put it out a few months ago about what's important to investors. And number like 1 or 2 on the list was communication and control. And so I have this hunch that it's not actually control. I don't think that most investors out there that have over a certain number of units are looking to declare whether it should be $25 in rent increase or $50. I think what they want is visibility and control over the strategy. And then they want a really good partner in a management company that can go out and execute operationally at a strong level on that strategy. Because that I think that's what they need, and that's what we're aiming to deliver. And so I think, the last piece of that is just making sure that our key performance indicators internally align with what an investor's key performance indicators are that they're looking at on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really critical role of a PM. And I always use the analogy as it relates to like asset management versus property management, because a lot of investors don't understand where not that there's a line between the two, but where that real delineation occurs. And, the football analogy is property management is the blocking and the tackling. The asset management is calling the plays oftentimes. Or if you're to use a personnel example, the quote unquote owner asset manager is the head coach. The property manager is the quarterback, right? He's out on the field implement or actually executing on the game plan. You can have a great quarterback that understands why the coach is devising the game plan the way that they are and why he's making the decisions that he is. And that's typically the trait of a good property manager. Trait of a bad one is I'm just going to go out there and I'm just doing what I'm being told without understanding the why behind the decisions that are being made.
Yeah.
And I think that reflects in a PM a lot of ways, at least what we try to do internally, where we want our staff to have an understanding of what drives value, for example, in commercial real estate. Because as you mentioned, depending on the strategy, the answer to one or the solution to one problem could be different, right? Where it's we're about to list a unit, right? We're about to list a unit for lease. We can list it at $2,000 a month. That's probably where it'll lease, and it'll lease within 14 days. And that's right around fair market rent, et cetera. But if you are getting prepared to sell the building or you're getting ready to refinance the building, you might want to try to shoot for a little bit more, knowing that you're going to accept a little bit more vacancy, but you're trading some short-term cash flow for a higher appraised value or a more marketable sale. And maybe if that row we listed for 2,100 or we listed for even higher with a big concession so that you lock in a nice rent on the rent roll. And Most PMs don't have the ability to do that. And I think oftentimes, as everything does in a business, right, it starts top down. You have to educate every layer of staff within your organization to think through those lenses. But I think that's one of the biggest things, right? It's like the average PM, okay, yeah, I'll list it for the price you want me to list it, X, Y, and Z. But the good one says, well, I know you were thinking about refining it or potentially selling it. Maybe this is an approach that we should take to maximize your end objective.
Yeah. You've got to be able to, and this is where I think some of the sales stuff comes in handy from years ago. I had a leader at one point that had said, if you're in a sales meeting and somebody says something that's incorrect about your product or their understanding of it, and you don't push back, that's like not going to get you the sale. And there's a lot of investors out there, they're great investors, but it may be helpful for them to see a different point of view. And, it is important, I think, that we're able to say, based on our experience with the hundreds and hundreds of units that we manage, here's what we're seeing, and here's another way to look at it, and here's maybe what we recommend. Those strategic decisions you mentioned are what we want to align with. And I think one of the things good management companies are doing now, I think we're certainly doing, is managers, as you said at the beginning of this call, management companies are historically coming from very operationally heavy places. They're great at process, or a lot of them are great at process. They're not very customer centric by default, right? And so we're really trying to realign, instead of saying like, we are semi-departmental, but instead of saying this person handles AP and this person handles leasing and this person handles this, we're combining that with like this customer centric. You hear in technology a lot, customer success rep. And so we have customer success representatives that have a holistic picture of what a specific client is looking to do from a strategic standpoint. And they are working with all the various pieces to say, okay, well, here's what we need to do for a leasing strategy. Here's what we need to do for a maintenance strategy, et cetera, to make sure that client is getting the experience and the expertise that they need. That, I think, is a reasonable shift. One point of clarification, I'm not from San Francisco. San Francisco is a wonderful city.
Worked out there. I meant to say. Yeah, that's what I meant to say.
I'm an East Coast guy. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, actually, but I live on Cape Cod. No, I just had a note here. I had to correct you.
That was the last thing you needed out there in the ether. No, I meant to say where you spent a chunk of your career. Well, I just think it's interesting. And now, this is a total aside and going down a different road, but the amount of, and I'm sure you get the same, cold outreach from Silicon Valley based companies or entrepreneurs that are like, we figured out how to do this better. And it's like, you don't know, you're not in the trenches, right? It's easy to iterate from afar, but I think that another dynamic is just like a PM, whether you're a third party PM working with clients, whether you're doing it in-house, whether you're managing your own stuff, right? And building a team to manage your own stuff. There is so much that goes into property management, like especially third party, where you're basically a bookkeeper, you're a leasing agent, you're a property manager, you're a project manager on construct, you're a maintenance man. You have like 7 different roles.
Yeah.
And you're usually just trying to keep your arms around everything that's needed of you and like trying to keep the whole enterprise together while optimizing along the way. And it's interesting, like tech, I think it just has a hard time. It has a hard time replacing again, it comes back to, you just mentioned customer success, customer experience, et cetera. Like it's really hard to find out where that gets integrated unless you're in there in the trenches, actually looking at what's involved in a day-to-day basis. I do want to talk about leasing specifically, because I think you mentioned use Tenant-Friendly, and we use that as a platform. It's great. But let's talk about your leasing process with a scattered site portfolio that, I would imagine you're managing properties within 45 minutes, kind of an hour radius. I mean, if you're getting, up there, kind of Dorchester down to the South Shore on the Cape, like about an hour, more or less, we can just call it an hour. How do you manage the leasing of that in terms of on a day-to-day basis? Is you have a leasing agent running around that whole area? Are you leveraging any other tech, self-showing, stuff like that? How do you handle leasing?
Yeah, so it's great. So, our leasing is similar to maintenance, right? We've got our back office that is they're answering all of the inquiries. So, do you allow smoking, right? Do you allow pets? What's the address? Can I do a showing? What's the credit score got to be? All that stuff is done in our back office, and it's centralized. So it does not matter that they're not, local to the property. And so we sort of combine that, right? We've got Tenant Turner, and we obviously market it on all the sites that we can. And we are answering those calls and those texts very like clockwork, very, very efficient at answering those questions. We want to collect as many of those leads as we can and get them in to see a showing. We do leverage both in person. There's 3 types of showings that we do. It's 4 really. We leverage self showings. So we're happy to do that. We do some verification ahead of time. You know how Tenant Turner works. You need an ID, some things like that. We ask them to answer a series of questions. They have to self-identify as having a certain credit score, no criminal record, things like that. No pets if it's no pets allowed. Of course, they can lie, right? But we're going to find that out later anyways. And so there's not a huge point in doing that, but it cuts down on some of the sort of frivolous showings. Second to that, we do group type showings where we say, okay, if you don't want to do one of the self showings, we do 2 showings a week, one on Saturday, one on Tuesday night. And we sort of, our back office confirms those. So when our leasing agent shows up, there's, people are there and they know where to go and all that. And then we do individual showings, need be. And when we leverage agents at times. It's not frequent, but we do, especially in the Boston market. If we get down there, we leverage some agents because it's just a bit more agent heavy. But once the resident sees the property, we're immediately sending how is the property? Is there anything we can improve? We get reporting on that. So you're familiar with Tenant Turner, but if there's 4 people that said the apartment smells like cat urine, we can address that, right? So we would have addressed it before, but say for some cat went in there and peed in the interim, we'd know about it. We could fix it. And then, we're handling all of our application process and all that stuff back office.
Gotcha. It's interesting. I'm originally from New Hampshire. I live in Boston. I've lived down here for a while. I did a couple of the stints with agents, owners who hired agents, and then the tenants paying the broker fee. From being out of state, that is the most foreign, ridiculous concept to me as an aside. And I think I've talked about this to friends of mine who, maybe I met in college or who don't live in the Boston area. That concept absolutely blows their mind, where it's like, so the owner hires the broker to lease the unit and the tenant pays the fee. It's like totally perverse and backwards in most people's brains.
I agree.
There's legislation around that now, or potential legislation around, how that's being handled? I'm actually this is me asking out of curiosity.
Yeah.
In terms of, is that something that might be going away or going to be further looked at within the state?
Yeah, so I'm not the expert on that, and here's why. So we don't do a lot of work in Boston itself. And so the way the law is written is, we're not a brokerage. We don't buy or sell. We are experts at managing properties and experts at leasing. And in the Boston market specifically, because rent tenants do pay that fee, the only people that can collect that fee are a broker. So a landlord can't collect that fee, nor can a property manager collect that fee.
Gotcha.
And so because of that, it doesn't really align with our revenue model and how we do things. Outside of Boston, we charge our client the fee. We usually do like half a month's rent. We give them a break on the finding fee for the renter because we're a recurring revenue model. So I don't have expertise on that specifically. It is really weird. I can tell you, I lived in New York City for a while, and they do it there too. New York, I believe, if I'm correct, New York does not allow that anymore. I think Boston is maybe the last city. Look, Boston has some really smart investors, but the rental scene is very outdated. I mean, it's insane. It's like, I can't believe it. I mean, it's like, I don't know. But
Well, it's funny. And not that it's going to be a big focal point of our conversation here, but I always just find it to be interesting where not only do you have that dynamic, you just have an entire city moving on September 1st.
I know.
which is, driven by the student rent cycle fundamentally, but you still have most leases, or I shouldn't say most, but you just have such a large percentage of units turning over, whether it's students or not students or mid 20s, late 20s, early 30s. It's an interesting city to come and move to when you're just from a market or a place where it's a little bit more normally functioning. But
it's its own animal. I mean, and that's why we're really not in Boston. It's like, if you're going to play in Boston, you that's probably where you're going to play, and you're not going to play outside of Boston. It's just a different that September 1st thing is pretty insane too.
Yeah. Now, again, this is a question that, I guess is a little sensitive to ask. At least some people might think it is. The landlord tenant laws are obviously quite tenant friendly in Massachusetts, as they are in a lot of states. I'm always curious in regards to, you have a client who's buying a property. They've got, 6 unit, 8 units, 3 units, whatever it might be. They want to go and do a value add. Rents are really low. We're going to try to help them implement a business plan here. We maybe want to turn these units. There's some period of time in which we want to do that. I don't even have a specific question other than, how do you think about that when you're taking on the management of a property where the owner is looking to execute some type of value add, access units, renovate, etc. Massachusetts, how does that typically work, or how do you at least think about it, would be the better question.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is, we work for the client, right? So we have a fiduciary responsibility to the client. The other thing I would mention is, I think landlords provide a service, right? And so investing in a multi-unit property and going in and renovating all the units, I mean, sure, there's some short-term pain there, but we now have a building with more safe units and more healthy units and nicer units and things like that. So those two things I think are important to mention. Having said that, the benefit that we have found, and it's funny because we didn't realize this until like we were at 300 or 400 units and we're like, oh, we should do this. One of the benefits of the scale that we have now is if a client comes in and wants to do a situation where we're dislocating, we need to relocate 6 people, 6 tenants. We could give them priority to one of the other hundreds and hundreds of units that we're renting, right? So we very much view, I don't view, and I think good landlords do not view their relationship with residents necessarily as conflicting, right? And so contentious, right? And so we would be we do things like we'd be very willing to work with those residents, help them find a comparable unit that's coming up. And we explain the why to them. Hey, this is what's happening. The owner's coming in here. He or she is doing these things. So we try to do that. The other thing we do a lot of, it's sort of related, is it doesn't behoove a landlord for a vacancy or an eviction. And that it's very expensive, the vacancy, the court, all that stuff. And so we work with residents. I mean, you're in the B and C class space. We are too. I mean, we work with residents on Raft and applying for other housing. We fill all that paperwork out for them and send it to them in PandaDoc, and just all they got to do is sign it. And so we are compassionate, I think, with residents where we can be. But obviously, we do have the fiduciary responsibility. And so if what we're looking to do is to value add and turn those units over, that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, but it's very different in different states, right? I mean, New Hampshire, you have a month-to-month resident, it's 30-day notice. It's black and white, right? California, Massachusetts, New York. I mean, there's all kinds of different states where there's different obligations from an ownership standpoint as it relates to how you can actually work through that process. But I guess it's, and I have friends that invest in Massachusetts, and they deal with this on every single deal. And it's a version of, okay, well, it's just longer notices. It's working with them a little bit more. Maybe there's more cash for keys. Maybe, it's staggered increases over a long period of time to try to get to some level of a finish line. It's just more time. It's a longer time horizon, I guess. Right. And I would imagine that, as you mentioned, there are the benefits of scale, which certainly helps with a lot of that. But the other piece of it too is probably just like working with the owner to align their expectations with how this process is going to work and like how long it might take. Yeah.
Yeah. And, that goes back to that strategic discussion we have with them, which is, do you want to turn everything over as soon as you can? Or do you want to say, look, these are the 2 residents that have been consistently late on rent, and this guy's got a dog there. And let's transition those residents out first, renovate those, and kind of do it. And so that's a good example, I think, of an old management arrangement would be that landlord telling us what to do each step of the way. What we're trying to do as an asset manager is come in and understand what their appetite is for turnovers and vacancies and improvements and things like that, and along what timelines. And then we can go out and execute on that and keep them up to date, but we don't need to be told, we don't need to ask, every single thing.
Yeah, exactly. Last question for you, and I think it's probably going to be an enlightening one for folks listening to this who are not property managers. But what makes a great property management client, like an owner that you work with? Obviously, the easy answer is they never reach out to us. They let us do our thing. That's probably the easier answer. But in terms of like, you've probably got a couple clients in mind that maybe fit this mold. What makes a good client? And the reason I ask that is I think a lot of property management clients want to be a good client with their PM so that they can let their PM do their job, not getting overly involved or intrusive, and how to strike a good relationship with their PM.
Yeah, I'm going to give you one word. It's partnership. All right. And I think, there is, it's funny you asked this, like this on my whiteboard here. We did a team meeting today. We're talking about our ideal customer profile. And ideal customer profile is 2 things. One is what makes us money, right? That's clear. But also who are the people we want to work with? Because we're going to provide much better service to the people that we want to work with. And when I say partner, I mean someone that is going to communicate with us effectively, tell us what they're looking to do so we can execute. They're going to, with respect, they're going to, look at us as a partner. I mean, if the property doesn't do well, we don't do well. A lot of our comp structure is based on performance and things like that too. So we just want someone that looks at us as a partner and we can help, see success within their portfolio. If it's someone that's really sort of, you work for me and they want to be involved in every tiny operational decision, it's probably not a great fit. We want them to design the strategy with our input, and we want to go out and execute on that strategy and provide them visibility so they know what we're doing, that we're doing just that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really hard, especially for smaller owners or the owners who are working with a PM for the first time to let it go. But it's like
Yeah.
ton of communication up front around what you want to do and
Yeah.
what you want to achieve.
Yeah.
And then you can't get involved at every step in the process because then we can't work efficiently. And then the
Yeah.
entire property management process around your particular asset or portfolio starts to struggle. At least that's what we've noticed internally in our business. But yeah. Anyways,
Well,
talk a little bit.
too, I mean, there's a top line impact too, right? I think a lot of people are apprehensive to use any property management company because they're worried about, hey, this is just an added cost. But, if we're actually working on a calculator we're going to put online, if we reduce vacancy by X and increase rents by Y and, X, Y, Z, the top line should go up too. And then our hope is that we mitigate costs. And so there's a play in there, I think, for having improving your bottom line or at least keeping it constant while getting like all your time back.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just highlighted maybe one of the bigger like mindset or incorrect mindset. I don't want to say mindset. One of the biggest misconstrued components of working with a PM for new investors is, as you mentioned, it's a cost. But are you good at management? I think that's a
Right.
question
Yeah. Right.
that's like a lot of newer folks that ask themselves, like, are you good at leasing? Are you good at, getting the maintenance guy out there fast? Are you overpaying for maintenance because you're working with the third party handyman charging $100 an hour or whatever it
Right.
might be? It's like if you're really, really good at it, okay, yeah, maybe you could do it better yourself. And then you get into the valuing your time, right? That's a whole nother piece of this. But before you even get to valuing your time, I think there's a lot of folks that are, if they actually had an honest assessment, like you might be under renting your units, you might be hesitant to raise rents on your existing tenants because you've got this personal relationship and you're petrified of having that uncomfortable
Yeah.
conversation. And next thing you know, it's like, yeah, you're paying your 7, 8% or whatever to your third party PM, but you're probably grossing 7, 8% more, or at least your NOI looks a little bit better at the bottom line. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think it can take people a while to get there, or at least to admit that. But I think that's very much a dynamic.
For sure. And the last thing I'll say is, we oftentimes, once you get above like 50 units, I'll say, send me your P&L and we'll look at it and we'll tell you where we can cut fixed costs and change this and change that and compare it to our standards. And, our goal is not that your P&L looks worse after partnering with us. It's that it looks either better or the same with you having all your time back. Either of those I think are wins.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Casey, this has been great. Where can folks learn more about you, learn more about your business, and reach out to you?
Yeah, definitely. Just, we're online, howserpropertymanagement.com. It's a long one, HOWZER, or call us. You can find it online. We'd love to chat.
Awesome.
Great
Thanks
being
again,
on the
man.
podcast. Thanks for having me. You got a great
Yeah,
show.
appreciate it.